Good day, everyone. I welcome all of you again to AruguInsights. Today, we'll be looking at something wonderful. I am Arugu Speaks on AruguInsights. Today, we'll be looking at the legal and institutional framework of seaport development in Nigeria. We're going to do a port-by-port analysis. This topic is dear to my heart because one thing that has slowed us down as a nation is our seaports. They have performed below average. And so we know that seaports are not just gateways, they are instruments of statecraft. Across history, from the imperial docks of London to the hyper-automated terminals of Shanghai, the nations that control their ports have controlled the arteries of global trade, and in the 21st century, that control is no longer defined by geography alone, but by law. Geography alone is not enough. The law behind the seaport is key. For a country like Nigeria, blessed with over 850 kilometers of coastline and positioned at the commercial crossroads of West Africa, seaports are far more than logistic hubs. They are the backbone of fiscal stability, the anchor of energy exports, and the front line of economic sovereignty. But here is the paradox. While ships, cranes, and containers dominate the skyline, the true foundation of every port lies invisible, buried not in the sand, but in statutes. A seaport is not merely engineered, it is legislated into existence. Before its simple dredger enters the channel, a dense web of legal authority must be activated. Coastal ownership must be defined under constitutional law. Environmental approvals must align with international obligations, such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Regulatory mandates must be distributed, often contentiously, between the federal agencies, the state government, and private concessionaires. And this is where the real story begins. Because Nigeria's port system is not governed by a single unified authority. Instead, it is shaped by an intricate and sometimes conflicting network of institutions. The Nigerian Ports Authority, the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NIMASA, the Federal Ministry of Marine and Blue Economy, and a growing class of private port developers operating under concession frameworks. Each of these actors claim a piece of the maritime domain. Each is backed by statutes, regulations, and policy instruments, and often their mandates collide. So the question is no longer just how ports are built, but who has the legal authority to build them. Today, on AruguInsights, we'll go beyond cargo throughput and shipping indices. We move past the headlines of congestion and infrastructure deficits to examine something far more fundamental. We're going to look at the legal architecture that determines whether a port thrives or fails before it even begins. This is not a lecture on legislation. This is the forensic audit of power. We will dissect Nigeria's seaports ecosystem port by port, from the legacy colonial infrastructure of Lagos and Port Harcourt to the new generation deep sea ports, redefining maritime economics, including the Lekki deep sea port and the strategic developments underway in Ibom and Bonny. We interrogate the core legal questions that shape maritime destiny. Who owns Nigeria territorial waters? We'll look at that. Who has the constitutional authority to license and develop ports? Where do federal powers end, and can states legitimately enter the seaport space? And when disputes arise, which legal regime prevails? Is it domestic law, contractual frameworks, or international obligations? Because beneath every successful port lies not just capital investment, but legal clarity. And where the clarity is absent, development does not slow, it fractures. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to AruguInsights. Once again, this is where law meets infrastructure and determines the future of maritime power. Let us begin at the foundation. We will look at the constitutional mandate, the federal supremacy doctrine. The blueprint for every port development in Nigeria begins here. The Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999. This is not just a legal document. It is the ultimate allocation of power over the nation's maritime sector, not just a maritime destiny, but the nation's entire legal system. That's why it is referred to as the Grand Norm. And to understand who controls Nigeria ports, we will begin with a foundational doctrine, the federal supremacy in maritime matters. Under Section 4 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999, the Constitution legislative authority is divided but not equally. There's this exclusive legislative list contained in Part 1 of the second schedule, and it draws a hard constitutional line. Items 36, 39, and 58 collectively vest control over shipping, navigation, maritime safety, and major ports squarely in the hands of the National Assembly. This is not administrative convenience. This is constitutional centralization, and its implications are far-reaching. First, port sovereignty is federal, not regional. No matter how resource-rich or strategically located a coastal state may be, it cannot unilaterally establish or operate an international seaport outside the legal authority of the federal government. Any such attempt will be constitutionally defective from inception. Second, all gateways into Nigeria remain federally controlled. Every vessel that enters Nigerian waters does not merely arrive at the port, it enters a sovereign jurisdiction regulated by federal institutions. Agencies such as the Nigerian Customs Service, the Nigerian Immigration Service, and the Port and Health Security Authorities operate under uniform national mandates. This ensures that trade policy, border control, and national security are not fragmented across 36 different legal regimes. The third point is uniformity It's not optional, it is mandatory. Maritime regulation must be consistent across the Federation, from the safety standard to vessel registration, from environmental compliance to cabotage enforcement. There cannot be parallel legal systems competing at state level. This is why institutions like the Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NIMASA, exist to maintain a single, coherent regulatory framework aligned with international standards. But here is where the tension emerges. Meanwhile, while the Constitution grants control, it does not eliminate interests. Coastal states, particularly those with deep water advantages, are naturally driven to develop ports as engines of local economic transformation. This is evident in projects like the Deep Seaport in Akwa Ibom State and the Age Deep Seaport in Bayelsa State. Yet, constitutionally, these states do not act as sovereign developers. They operate within a federally dominated legal space, which leads to a critical structural reality. State governments in Nigeria are not principals in international port development, they are strategic partners. They may provide land, facilitate investment, and drive political momentum. They may even initiate feasibility and concession frameworks. But ultimately, the legal authority to approve, regulate, and integrate these ports into Nigeria's maritime system rests entirely with the federal government of Nigeria. And this creates a delicate balance. Too much federal control and innovation is stifled. Too much state ambition and constitutional conflict emerges. The success or failure of Nigeria's next generation of seaports would depend on how well this balance is managed, not just economically, but legally, because in Nigeria, no port rises above the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999. Let us look at the constitutional foundation, the federal supremacy in port development. Let us look at the core institutional pillars, the big three. While several agencies operate within the port statutory bodies from the Institutional Trident of Nigeria's Seaport framework, let us now look at the first pillar, the barber of them all, the landlord of the system, the Nigerian Ports Authority, NPA. Established in 1954 and now governed by the Nigerian Ports Authority Act 2004, laws of the Federation, the Nigerian Ports Authority is not merely a port operator, it is the legal custodian of Nigerian ports infrastructure. If the Constitution defines who owns the power, the NPA Act defines who exercises it on the ground. At the heart of the NPA Act lies a powerful concept known as, quote, designated ports, unquote. These are not just geographical locations, they are legally defined maritime zones placed under the exclusive administrative and operational control of the NP. And once a port is designated, the powers of NP are not advisory, they are dominant and binding. Let us break down the scope of that power. Number one, infrastructure management. The NPA operates under the landlord port model, meaning it owns and manages the fixed assets of the port system, the quays, the berths, channels, and land. Private operators or terminal concessionaires may handle cargo, but they do so on infrastructure controlled by the NPA. This gives the NPA enduring leverage on every commercial activity within the Nigerian ports. What's the second? Safe navigation. The most critical and most consequential mandate is that of safe navigation. Under the NPA Act, the NPA is legally obligated to ensure that vessels can safely access Nigerian ports. This is not a passive duty. It includes hydrographic surveys to map seabed conditions, pilotage services to guide vessels through channels, and most importantly, dredging and continuous channel maintenance. This is where the law meets physics, because no matter how modern a port terminal may be, it is economically useless if vessels cannot reach it. Draft depth determines vessel size. Vessel size determines cargo volume, and cargo volume determines viability. In legal terms, the dredging obligation of the NPA is not optional, it is foundational to the existence of the port itself. Later on, in course of this discussion, we will tell you why the bulk of the ports in the Niger Delta have failed. It is absolutely because of the failure of the NPA to meet up with her statutory obligation to make sure that the channels are navigable. We'll go into all of that, but let us consider the third point. NPA is responsible for port planning and technical control. No new port project, whether public or private, can proceed without alignment with the technical standards and approval processes. From channel design to berth configuration, the NPA acts as the final gatekeeper of engineering feasibility within Nigeria's maritime domain. But here is where the analysis turns critical. Because with such expansive statutory powers comes corresponding responsibility. You know, they will tell you that with great power comes greater responsibility. And where that responsibility is not effectively discharged, the consequences are not just operational, they are legal and economic. Nowhere is this more evident than the Nigerian Eastern Corridor. Stretching across Port Harcourt, Warri, and Calabar, these ports are not failing because they lack infrastructure on ground. They are constrained because access channels have not been sustainably maintained to competitive depths. The result, larger vessels are systematically diverted to Lagos ports, shipping costs increase due to lightering and delays, concession terminals operate below capacity, and billions in regional economic potential remain locked out not by market forces, but by navigational limitations. This raises a profound legal question. When a statutory authority is mandated to ensure navigability and fails to do so effectively, does that failure amount to a breach of its enabling act or merely a policy shortfall? That is where the tension comes. And we will explore later, because in Nigeria's port system, control of the channel is control of the economy, and the NPA by law controls the channel. The question is, has it exercised that control in a way that unlocks national potential or constrains it? We have looked at NPA now. Let us look at the apex regulator of the maritime sector. That's the sheriff of the waters, the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, NIMASA. If the NPA is the landlord of the land and the channel, then NIMASA is the sheriff of the waters. Established under the NIMASA Act 2007, NIMASA represents Nigeria's interface with the global maritime regulatory order. While the NPA governs where ships go, NIMASA governs how ships behave and whether they are fit to operate at all. Its mandate is not local, it is international in character, domestic in enforcement. Let's break down the core pillars of that authority given to NIMASA. First, ship registration and flag state control. NIMASA is responsible for maintaining Nigeria's ship registry and ensuring the vessels flying the Nigerian flag comply with international safety, construction, and operational standards. This includes enforcement of conventions adopted under the International Maritime Organization. We have done very detailed work on the IMO and the international conventions made thereunder in one of our previous videos. Please go there, watch that video, and you will understand the role of the IMO as the apex regulator of the shipping industry in the entire world. The global body that set the rules of shipping is the IMO. In effect, NIMASA determines whether a vessel is legally seaworthy, not just under Nigerian law, but under the expectations of the international community. Second, NIMASA is responsible for maritime security and the ISPS regime. Through implementation of the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, ISPS code, NIMASA oversees the security architecture of Nigeria's ports and ships. This goes beyond patrols. It includes certification of port facility security plans, monitoring compliance against global anti-terrorism standards, coordinating responses to piracy and maritime threats in the Gulf of Guinea and in the region historically vulnerable to maritime insecurity. This mandate is not just theoretical, it is strategic to national and regional stability. A few months ago, we celebrated the fact that Nigeria has returned back to the Council of the IMO after 14 years of absence. It is the work of the IMO, of NIMASA, in curbing the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. Hitherto, it used to be the hotspot of piracy in the world. Today, the Deep Blue project of NIMASA in partnership with the Navy has stopped that, and our waters are now safe, internationally certified. The third point, NIMASA is involved in marine environmental protection. NIMASA enforces pollution, control measures, regulating oil discharges, ballast water management, and waste disposal from vessels. This aligns Nigeria with global environmental obligations and protects its fragile ecosystem, coastal ecosystems from operational damage. In this sense, NIMASA is both a regulator and a guardian, balancing commercial activity with environmental sustainability. You know, if you have one or two brothers, three brothers, yes, the likelihood of a clash. Let us look at institutional friction. But here is where the system becomes complicated, because while the law clearly defines functions, it does not always clearly define boundaries. The NPA is responsible for harbor safety, a term that is tied to navigation within port limits, channel management, pilotage, and physical access. NIMASA, on the other hand, is responsible for maritime safety, a broader concept encompassing vessel integrity, crew standards, and operational compliance. On paper, these distinctions seem clear, but in practice, it often overlaps. Consider this. A vessel entering port with questionable safety compliance, is that a NIMASA enforcement issue or that of NPA access control issue? Again, a security breach within the port limits, does jurisdiction fall on the ISPS mandate of NIMASA or port authority control of NP? A navigational hazard that is caused by a non-compliant vessel, who has the final authority to detain, direct, or deny entry? Is it NIMASA or the NPA? On paper, the law seems good enough, but in practice, friction occurs. These are not theoretical conflicts, they are operational realities. Historically, these jurisdictional gray zones have led to delays in vessel clearance, duplication of inspection, regulatory uncertainty for ship owners and terminal operators, and at times institutional rivalry that undermines efficiency in a system where time is money. Even minor overlaps can produce major economic consequences. But what we discuss is not the problem, the core problem. The issue is not that Nigeria lacks regulation. No. The issue is that it has multiple regulators operating within intersecting legal spaces. And when authority is shared but not precisely demarcated, power becomes contested. That's the truth. The bigger question: can a port system achieve global competitiveness when its core safety and security functions? The bigger question: can a port system achieve global competitiveness when its core safety and security functions are divided between institutions with overlapping mandates? Or does the efficiency require a clearer consolidation, or at least sharper coordination of authority? Because in maritime governance, clarity is not just administrative, it is operational, and where that clarity is absent, ships do not just wait, they divert. We've looked at NPA, we have looked at NIMASA, let us look at the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission, ICRC. Before 2006, Nigeria's port system was built on a single overstretched institution. The NPA was everything. NPA was landlord, NPA was operator, NPA was regulator, an NPA was service provider. It owned infrastructure, yet, but it also loaded the vessels, it managed the terminals, operated the cranes, controlled warehousing. In theory, this was centralized efficiency. In reality, it became centralized inefficiency. The Nigerian case law is replete with cases against NPA that will show you that the NPA was almost like a sleeping giant. Cases of inefficiency and failure in the operational responsibilities. Congestion became systemic. Turnaround time stretched into weeks. Cargo clearance was unpredictable, and Nigeria's ports, despite their strategic location, became bottlenecks in global trade rather than gateways. Sometimes something had to change. The structural break, the landlord model. In 2026, Nigeria executed one of the most consequential maritime reforms in its history, the port concession reform. It was not just policy, it was a structural redefinition of roles. Under the new landlord model, the NPA retained ownership of the port infrastructure, but operational control of terminals was transferred to private sector operators. Commercial risk shifted away from government. Efficiency, investment, and innovation were outsourced to entities with global expertise. In simple terms, the government stopped running ports and started regulating and leasing them. Let us look at the legal engine. The PPP governance under the ICRC Act. The transition was not left to policy discretion. It was codified and institutionalized under the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission Establishment Act 2005. The ICRC Act established the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission, ICRC, the central authority responsible for overseeing all public-private partnerships arrangements in Nigeria, and this is where law becomes the engine of investment, because under the ICRC framework, port concessions are not arbitrary deals. They must satisfy three core legal conditions. One, competitive tendering. No terminal can be handed out informally. Concessions must pass through structured bidding processes designed to attract credible global operators and ensure value for money outcomes. Two, transparency and contract integrity. Every concession agreement is subject to regulatory scrutiny, ensuring that terms, obligations, and risk allocations are clearly defined and enforceable. Three, for value, fair value for the state, the federal government as asset owner must receive appropriate economic returns through lease fees, royalties, and performance benchmarks. Let us look at the private operators. Global capital meets Nigerian ports. This legal framework opened the doors for major international and domestic operators to enter Nigeria's port space. Companies like APM Terminals and Tinkan Island Container Terminal stepped in to modernize terminal obligations, bringing in advanced cargo handling systems, improved turnaround efficiency, private capital for equipment and upgrades. For the first time, Nigerian ports began to operate within a commercial performance framework, not just a bureaucratic one. Let us see how it will go. From the brownfield to greenfield, the Lekki model. But the true power of the ICRC Act is not just in reforming existing ports. It lies in enabling entirely new ones. Projects like the Lekki Deep Sea Port are products of this legal architecture. These are not traditional government-built ports. They are PPP, public-private partnership-driven, investor-backed, legally structured mega projects where land is provided through government coordination, capital is raised by private and international investors, risk is contractually allocated, and long-term operation is secured through concession agreements. This is the future of port development in Nigeria, and it is powered not by policy statements, but by enforceable legal frameworks. The 2026 reform did more than improve efficiency. It fundamentally changed the philosophy of governance from state control to state supervision, from public monopoly to regulated competition, from budget-funded infrastructure to investment-driven development. But as we see later, while concessions solve many problems, they also introduce new ones. Contract enforcement disputes, tariff regulation tension, and questions about whether the public interest is always aligned with private profit. Because in Nigeria, port system reform is never the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new set of legal and institutional battles. We will now examine these frameworks, we will now examine how these frameworks collide in real port environments and what that means for performance on the ground. We will do a port-by-port legal and strategic audit. We have looked at how beautiful and plausible the idea of concessioning is. Let us see how it works on ground. And now, we understand the laws of major players, but how does this framework operate in real-world situations? Let's begin with exclusive port-by-port audit, tracing the maritime corridors of Nigeria. Let us look at the Western Corridor, the Lagos Port Complex. The Lagos Port Complex is the historical heartbeat of Nigerian trade, but it is also the center of its greatest logistics nightmare. That's what it is. Apapa Port is not just Nigeria's largest port. It is the historical nucleus of the nation's maritime economy. For decades, the Apapa Port has functioned as the primary gateway for imports and the critical outlets for exports. Legally, it operates as a designated port under the Nigerian Ports Authority Act 2004, administered by the Nigerian Ports Authority. On paper, it is one of the most institutionally robust ports in Africa. Let us look at the institutional ecosystem, a concentration of federal power. Within Apapa, the full architecture of Nigeria's maritime governance is present. The Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, overseeing safety and compliance, the Nigerian Customs Service, controlling trade flows and revenue collection, the Nigerian Immigration Service, managing border entry, the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, enforcing anti-narcotics law, the National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control, regulating consumables and pharmaceuticals, and the Nigerian Police Force maintaining security. This is federal authority in the most concentrated form. A fully assembled regulatory state inside a single port complex. And yet, despite the density of power, Apapa became synonymous with dysfunction. The core legal failure, the port access versus the land use control. The most profound failure of Apapa is not operational, it is jurisdictional, because the law draws a boundary that logistics does not respect. It doesn't respect. The statutory authority of the NPA ends at the port gate. Beyond the gate, a different legal regime begins. The access roads fall under the Federal Ministry of Works. Urban traffic regulation and land use enforcement involves the Lagos state government. What a contradiction. This creates a fragmented governance corridor. The authority controls the port, that's NPA, another controls the roads, the Federal Ministry of Works, and neither has full legal responsibility for the end-to-end movement of cargo in legal terms. This is a broken chain of authority. The consequence, a decade of gridlock. What followed from this broken chain of authority was not just congestion, it was systemic paralysis. The infamous Apapa gridlock was not caused by a single failure, it was the predictable outcome of institutional disconnection. Trucks flooded access roads with no unified scheduling system. Road infrastructure deteriorated without coordinated intervention. Enforcement became inconsistent across overlapping authorities, and no single institution had the legal mandate to impose order across the entire logistics corridor. The result, Apapa became one of the most expensive ports in the world to exit, not because of port inefficiency alone, but because the law stopped at the gate. The missing link, no port access management authority. At the heart of the crisis was a legal vacuum. There was no unified, statutorily empowered Port Access Management Authority, no single body with the power to coordinate trucks movement, regulate logistics from the hinterland to the quay, and force compliance across federal and state jurisdictions. In advanced port systems globally, access corridors are treated as extension of the port itself. In Nigeria, they are treated as externalities. That's the omission. That's the vacuum. That's the lacuna. Contractual limitations. The 2006 concession gap. The problem was compounded by the second layer of legal weakness. The design of the 2006 concession agreements, while these agreements enabled under the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission Establishment Act 2005, successfully transferred terminal operations to private operators. Many of them focused heavily on import performance metrics but failed to integrate logistics chain efficiency indicators. Critically, truck turnaround time, the single most important variable affecting congestion, was often not embedded as a binding key performance indicator. We'll be talking about KPI. KPI here means key performance indicator. This created a legal blind spot. Terminal operators could technically comply with concession terms, while the overall logistics systems collapsed around them. And because these inefficiencies occurred outside the strict contractual scope, the ability of the MPA to impose penalties and enforce corrective measures was limited. The bigger lesson we need to learn from this. Apapa, the Gridlock, there teaches us a fundamental truth about port development. A port is not just a place, it is a system. And when that system is governed by fragmented legal authorities, even the most strategically located port can become economically inefficient. Let us look at this strategic question. Can Nigeria build globally competitive ports without legally integrating port operations, transport infrastructure, urban planning into a single coordinated framework? We need answers, because from Apapa it proves that one thing beyond doubt: you cannot solve a logistic problem with isolated legal mandates. We have talked about Apapa Port now. Let us now veer to the Tinkan Island to complete the ports in Lagos. Tinkan is actually an overflow terminal. Just across the creek from Apapa lies the Tinkan Island port, a port born out of crisis, constructed rapidly in the late 1970s to absorb the overflow from the infamous cement armada that paralyzed Apapa. Tinkan was designed as the relief valve, but over time, it has evolved into something more significant, a testing ground for Nigerian port reform experiment. Let us look at institutional character, the pure landlord model in action. If Apapa represents a hybrid legacy system, Tinkan represents the closest thing Nigeria has to a fully concessioned port environment. Under the NPA Act 2004 and the post-2006 reforms, the NPA retains ownership of land and infrastructure, but terminal operations, as I've spoken on this earlier, are almost entirely in private hands. Operators such as Tinkan Island Container Terminal and Port and Cargo Handling Services control cargo handling, equipment development, yard management, and terminal level logistics. Here, the state has effectively stepped back from operations. The NPA functions strictly as a landlord and technical regulator, nothing more. On paper, this is exactly what the 2006 reform intended. Efficient, commercially driven, performance-oriented port operations. The real bottleneck, law, not the infrastructure. But Tinkan exposes a critical limitation of that model. You can privatize operations, but you cannot privatize legal authority, because while the NPA controls movement, it does not control release. The power lies with the Nigerian Customs Service, operating under the Nigerian Customs Service Act 2023. And this is where efficiency begins to unravel. The customs as the legal gatekeeper. In any port system, cargo is not truly cleared when it is offloaded. It is cleared when it is legally cleared. At Tinkan, the legal release depends entirely on customs processes, including tariff classification, duty assessment, physical inspection protocols, documentation verification, and these are not operational decisions, they are legal determinations. Let us look at the fiction. Discretion against speed. The challenge lies in the nature of customs authority. Customs officers exercise statutory discretion, particularly in reclassifying goods under different tariff codes, ordering physical examination of containers, challenging declared values. While this discretion is essential for revenue protection and anti-smuggling enforcement, it introduces uncertainty and delay into the system. What is the result? Containers that should move in days remain for weeks. Shipping lines incur demurrage. Importers face escalating costs, and the port designed for flow becomes a holding zone. The automation imperative. The future of Tinkan now hinges on a critical legal and technological shift. The transition from discretionary manual processes to rule-based automated systems. This includes electronic cargo clearance platforms, risk-based inspection systems, pre-arrival processing framework, and most visibly, the enforcement of electronic truck call-up systems. These systems aim to replace human bottlenecks with predictability, legally structured workflows. But here is the challenge. Automation is not just a technological upgrade, it requires statutory backing and institutional discipline. Without clear legal mandates, digital systems can be bypassed, manual overrides can persist, and reform becomes optional rather than enforceable. At the risk of sounding immodest, I'll compare this with how INEC told us that they could not upload results on the iRev because of a glitch they experienced during the process. If that process had been backed fully by law, passed by the National Assembly and the Electoral Act, that kind of case would not arise. That's what we are talking about in our ports. Bringing the best facilities on ground. If there is no law mandating that would be the process. Nigerians, they'll still bypass the process and do what they want, because in doing what they want, it paves way for the graft and all that is involved in the Nigerian system, the evolving legal frameworks. The push for full customs automation is ongoing but incomplete. It sits at the intersection of legislative reform, administrative regulation, and institutional culture. Until these align, Tinkan remains caught between a modern operational model driven by private efficiency and a traditional regulatory framework driven by legal discretion. What is the core lesson we need to learn? Tinkan proves a critical point in port governance. Efficiency is only as strong as the slowest legal process in the chain. You can modernize terminals, you can concession operations, you can invest in infrastructure, but if cargo release remains legally complex, discretion, and slow, the entire system stalls. Let us look at this strategic question. Can Nigeria achieve true port efficiency without fully reforming the legal architecture of customs operations? Or will ports like Tinkan continue to operate as high-capacity systems constrained by low-speed legal processes? Let us know what you feel about this. Because in the end, let us take note of this. A port does not move at the speed of cranes, it moves at the speed of the law. That's what matters. In the Western Corridor, there is this emerging trend, the deep sea corridor. The limitations of Lagos ports, river ports, the 13.5 meter drafts, the urban congestion necessitated a new legal and fiscal model. Let us look at the Lekki deep sea port. That is, in my view, the game changer. Here is a more expensive, high-impact version that deepens the legal sophistication and strategic importance of Lekki. Let us do a case study of the Lekki deep sea port and the future of port development in Nigeria. Commissioned in 2023, Lekki deep sea port is not just a new port, it is a legal and economic turning point in Nigeria's maritime history. Since the rise of Apapa port, no single project has so fundamentally redefined how ports are conceived, financed, and governed in Nigeria, because Lekki is not an upgrade, it is a complete reset. The revolutionary legal model, the build, own, operate, and transfer in action model, the boat in action model. Lekki is Nigeria's first fully realized greenfield deep seaport, developed under a build, own, operate, and transfer BOOT concession framework. This is critical. Unlike legacy ports built and funded by government, Lekki was designed by private capital, financed through international investment, constructed outside the traditional public procurement model, and now operated commercially for decades before eventual transfer to the state. This is not public infrastructure with private assistance. This is private infrastructure enabled by public law. That's what Lekki is all about. Let us look at the legal architecture, a multi-layered power structure. At the heart of Lekki lies one of the most sophisticated PPP structures in Africa, anchored under the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission Establishment Act 2005 and supervised by the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission ICRC. Let's break down this architecture. One, there is a guarantor, the sovereign gatekeeper. The Nigerian Port Authority NPA acts as the guarantor of the concession. This ensures that even within a private-led structure, the port remains anchored within Nigeria's sovereign maritime framework. Two, there is a concessionaire, the Special Purpose Vehicle PSV. The project is legally executed through the Lekki Port LFTZ Enterprise Limited, an SPV created solely to develop and manage the port. This structure isolates risk, ensures financial clarity, and provides a single legal entity accountable for performance. And then the shareholding structure, that's the power coalition. Lekki's ownership reflects a strategic blend of global capital and domestic interests. China Harbor Engineering Company, majority investor and technical driver. Tolerant Group, commercial and logistic expertise. Lagos State Government, land, policy alignment, and regional integration. The federal government through NPA, sovereign oversight and regulatory anchoring. This is not just financing, it is geopolitics, commerce, and the law converging in a single project. Then, the fourth team, the operator, global terminal expertise. Operational control is handled by Terminal Investors Limited, a subsidiary of the global shipping giant Mediterranean Shipping Company, MSC. This ensures that Lekki is not just built to global standards, it is run by a global logistics powerhouse. Institutional implications, autonomy within regulation. Because of its legal structure and ICRC's oversight, Lekki operates with a level of operational autonomy, contractual clarity, and performance discipline that is largely absent in legacy ports. Unlike Apapa or Tinkan, where inefficiencies are often diffused across multiple agencies, Lekki's concession framework clearly defines roles and responsibilities, embeds performance obligations into binding contracts, allocates risk to the parties best positioned to manage it. In essence, law has been used here not just to regulate, but to engineer efficiency. The advantage, that's where law meets geography. One of Lekki's most transformative features is its legally mandated 16.5 meter draft. This is not just an engineering specification, it is a contractual obligation. It ensures that the port can accommodate ultra-large container vessels, ULCVs, direct international shipping routes, and higher cargo volumes per call. For the first time in our history as a nation, Nigeria can compete for mainline vessel traffic rather than relying on feeder services. And in maritime economics, that changes everything. Let us look at the strategic significance of this innovation in Lekki. Lekki represents a proof of concept that Nigeria can deliver world-class porting structure not through traditional state-led development, but through legally structured private participation. It demonstrates that when the concession framework is clear, the regulatory environment is stable, and the risk allocation is commercially viable, global capital will respond. But here is the caution. Lekki's success also raises new legal questions. How will tariff regulation be managed in a privately dominated port? Can the government enforce public interest obligations over time? What happens at the point of transfer under the BOOT model? And will legacy ports be able to compete within the same legal ecosystem? Because while Lekki solves many of yesterday's problems, it introduces tomorrow's regulatory challenges. Let us, by way of insight from AruguInsights, Lekki is not a port. It is a template for others to follow, a demonstration that the future of the Nigerian maritime infrastructure lies at the intersection of law, capital, and institutional discipline. As we move forward, one question becomes unavoidable. Will Nigeria replicate this model across Ibom, Bonny, and beyond? Or will Lekki remain the exception rather than the rule? Because in the evolution of ports, the law you design determines the infrastructure you get. We have carefully looked at the western corridor of the Nigerian ports. Now we will look at the eastern corridor, the resource belt. That's where you have the prolific Niger Delta region, where the entire crude that sustains this country, where the crude that is keeping this country as one is produced, even though there is nothing to show that they are the producers of that crude. But that's a topic for another day. We will look at that another day. Why is the Niger Delta so poor, even when the Niger Delta is responsible for sustaining this country? The eastern ports should logically serve the oil industry and the vibrant commercial hubs of the southeast and south-south, yet they handle less than 20% of Nigeria's total cargo. Why? The answer is largely institutional. Less than 20% of Nigeria's entire cargo. Why? Who is responsible? Who is changing the eastern seaports? Let us look at the Onne port. This is the oil and gas success story. In Nigeria's eastern corridor, often defined by underperformance, one port stands apart. Onne port is the anomaly. It works, it thrives, it competes. So the question is not what went wrong in the east, but what went right in Onne. the legal difference? A port inside a free trade zone. The answer lies not in geography but in law. Onne operates within the Onne oil and gas free zone established under the Nigeria's free zone regime anchored by Nigeria Export Processing Zones Act. This changes everything because within a free zone, the normal rules of traffic, of trade are deliberately modified to stimulate investment and efficiency. Onne is not just a port, it is a legally insulated commercial environment. The advantages: law as a performance multiplier. Operating under the free zone framework grants Onne three decisive advantages. One, fiscal incentives. Companies operating within the zone benefit from tax concessions, duty exemptions on ports, reduced bureaucratic costs. This makes Onne not just operationally efficient, but financially attractive. Two, expedited custom regime. Unlike conventional ports, where the Nigerian Customs Service applies full import procedures, here the free zone operates under a modified customs framework. Goods entering the zone are treated as being made outside Nigeria's custom territory. For regulatory purposes, clearance processes are faster and less intrusive. Documentation requirements are streamlined. The result is speed, and in port economics, speed is competitiveness. The third point is relaxed regulatory environment. Free zones are designed to minimize friction, fewer overlapping inspections, simplified licensing processes, faster decision-making cycles. This creates a predictable business environment, something that is often lacking in conventional port systems. The strategic role, the energy logistics hub of Africa. Because of this legal architecture, Onne has evolved into Africa's leading oil and gas logistics base. It is the primary support hub for offshore exploration and production activities in the Gulf of Guinea, international oil companies operating in Nigeria, and critically, the Nigeria LNG Limited project in Bonny Island. This is not container traffic. This is high-value, time-sensitive industrial logistics where delay costs millions, and what Onne delivers the one thing that sector demands: predictability under law. Why Onne succeeds where others struggle. Onne exposes a fundamental truth about port development in Nigeria. General purpose legal framework produce general purpose results. Specialized legal frameworks produce high performance outcomes. That's the answer. While ports like Apapa and Tinkan operate under broad multi-agency regulatory systems, often burdened by overlap and delay, Onne operates under a targeted legal regime designed for a specific industry. It does not try to serve everyone. It is optimized to serve one sector and one sector alone exceptionally well. That's the oil and gas sector in Nigeria, the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. The limitation, a model, not a universal solution. But Onne's success also comes with a caveat. Its model is sector specific. It thrives because oil and gas logistics require controlled, high-efficiency environment. It benefits from concentrated, high-value cargo flows, and it operates within a legally ring-fenced ecosystem. This model cannot be transplanted wholesale to general cargo ports without adaptation. What is the legal lesson we learn? If Onne represents the future of PPP-driven infrastructure, then Onne represents the power of targeted legal ecosystem. Together they reveal the two most effective pathways for port success in Nigeria: structural reform through concessions and performance enhancement through specialized legislation. The question for Nigeria is clear. Will future ports be built under broad generic frameworks or under precisely engineered legal regimes designed to succeed or designed for success? Because Onne proves one thing beyond doubt. When the law is right, the port works. Let us now move to the Port Harcourt port. It's a legacy port. The Port Harcourt port is one of Nigeria's oldest maritime gateways. Its origin traceable to colonial era railway legislation designed to move raw materials from the hinterland to the coast. If you go to the Port Harcourt port, you will know that it was designed to ferry coal from Enugu to Port Harcourt. Primarily, that was one of the reasons. It was never designed for today's cargo volume, and more critically, it was never legally structured for modern expansion. Today, it stands at a port with strategic relevance but structural limitations. Institutional role, a functional but constrained asset. Under the NPA Act, as we have talked about, the NPA continues to administer ports, Port Harcourt Port, as a designated port. Its operational focus is narrower than the Lagos ports, handling bulk cargo, supporting industrial logistics, and servicing the refining ecosystem in Rivers State, including facilities that are tied to broader petroleum value chain. It remains important but no longer dominant. The core problem, a physical limit with a legal route. At first glance, Port Harcourt's challenges appear purely physical. It has a shallow draft, aging quay structures, limited yard space, and constrained expansion corridors. But beneath these operational issues lie deeper constraints: land. And in Nigeria, land is not just a physical resource, it is a legal regime. Let us look at the Land Use Act barrier. The Land Use Act 1979 fundamentally reshaped land ownership in Nigeria by vesting all land within the state and the governor to be held in trust for the people. That's common knowledge. In theory, this simplifies land administration, but in practice, for strategic infrastructure like ports, introduces layers of control and negotiation. For the NPA, this creates a structural dilemma. NPA has statutory responsibility to develop and expand ports, but it does not have automatic control over adjacent land required for that expansion. Instead, it must seek the consent of the governor, navigate state-level land allocation processes, address compensation and settlement issues, and often negotiate within politically sensitive environments. The result, development delays and spatial limitation. This legal framework has had direct consequences for Port Harcourt port expansion projects as slowed by land acquisition, bottlenecks, modernization. Efforts are constrained by limited physical footprint. Private investors are facing uncertainty over land tenure security, and long-term planning becomes reactive rather than strategic. In a sector where scale determines competitiveness, instability to expand is equivalent to gradual decline. Inability to expand is equivalent to gradual decline. The federal and state tension. What we see here is a classic constitutional friction. Ports fall under federal legislative authority, but lands fall under state-controlled administration. This creates a dual system where the federal government is responsible for port development but depends on state governors for the land required to execute this mandate. In effect, the power to build is separated from the power to locate the space. Let us look at the strategic consequence of this friction. The Port Harcourt port is not failing because it lacks relevance. It is constrained because it lacks legal flexibility to grow. And this raises a critical policy question. Should nationally strategic infrastructure like seaports be subject to the same land and location constraints as ordinary development projects? Let us look at this. Or should there be a special legal regime that streamlines land acquisition for critical maritime assets? That's a query for all of us to answer. The bigger lesson, Port Harcourt demonstrates a powerful insight. Infrastructure does not expand where the law does not permit it. You can have demand, strategic location, and institutional backing, but without legal access to land, development stalls. What is the final insight? If Apapa suffers from fragmented logistics control, and Tinkan from customs bottlenecks, then Port Harcourt suffers from something even more fundamental, a legal ceiling on physical growth. Because in the end, a port's capacity is not just determined by water depth or equipment, it is determined by how far the law allows it to expand. Let us now look at the war report. But before we get to war report, I think it is important to note that apart from the Onne port that is far away from Port Harcourt, the strategic relevance of Port Harcourt to the existence of the country Nigeria, I think Port Harcourt or Rivers State demands a port that is befitting the status of Rivers State as the treasure base of the nation. It is important we take note of this before we get to worry. Now let us move to war report. Because if you go to the Port Harcourt port, it is an insult to the city of Port Harcourt. That is not a seaport. It's an insult to the city of Port Harcourt. The war report. Let us move on. Established in 1954 and now governed by the NP Act 2004, the port is not merely a port operator, the NPA is not just merely a port operator, it is the legal custodian of the port infrastructure. If the Constitution defines who owns the power, the NPA defines who exercises it on ground. And at the heart of the NPA Act lies a successful concept, designated ports. We've discussed this. These are not just geographical locations, they are legally identified maritime zones placed under exclusive administrative and operational control of the NPA. And once a port is designated, the powers of the NPA are not advisory, they are dominant and binding. Let's break down the scope of that power. Infrastructure management. NPA operates under the landlord port model. We've discussed this, meaning it owns and manages the fixed assets of the port system, the quays, the berths, the channels, and the land. Private operators, terminal concessionaires may handle cargo, but they do so on infrastructure controlled by the NPA. This gives the NPA enduring leverage over commercial activity within the Nigerian ports. We've discussed this again. Safe navigation, the most critical and most consequential mandate under the Act, the NPA Act. NPA is legally obligated to ensure that vessels can safely access the port. This is not a passive duty. It includes hydrographic surveys to map seabed conditions, pilotage services to guide vessels through channels, and most importantly, dredging and continued channel maintenance. This is where law meets physics, because no matter how modern the port terminal may be, it is economically useless if vessels cannot reach it. Draft depth determines vessel size, and vessel size determines cargo volume determines viability. In legal terms, the NPA's dredging obligation is not optional, it is foundational to the existence of the port itself. Then, we have discussed this earlier on, but at the risk of sounding repetitive, because of its importance, port planning and technical control. No new port project, whether public or private, can proceed without alignment with the technical standards and approval processes of the NPA, from channel design to bed configuration. NPA acts as the final gatekeeper of engineering feasibility within Nigeria's maritime domain. But here is where the analysis turns critical, because with such expansive statutory power comes corresponding responsibility. And where that responsibility is not effectively discharged, the consequences are not just operational, they are legal and economic. Nowhere is this more evident than Nigeria's Eastern Corridor, stretching across Port Harcourt, Warri, and Calabar. These ports are not failing because they lack infrastructure on land. No, they are constrained because access terminals have not been sustainably maintained to competitive depths. What is the result? Larger vessels are systematically diverted to Lagos ports. Shipping costs increase due to lightering and delays. Concession terminals operate below capacity, and billions in regional economic potential remain locked out not by market forces, but by navigational limitations. This raises a profound legal question. When a statutory authority is mandated to ensure navigability and fails to do so effectively, does that failure amount to a breach of the Enabling Act or merely a policy shortfall? NPA has failed us, just like NNPC has failed us in the oil and gas sector. NPA has failed us in the maritime sector. These two sectors run the economy. That is the tension we'll explore. Because in the Nigerian port system, control of the channel is control of the economy, and the NPA by law controls the channel. The question again, now that we're talking about Warri, has he exercised that control in a way that unlocks national potential? Has it? Or it constrains it? Let us talk about Calabar Port. When we bring Calabar, we would weep. Calabar, the channel, the litigious channel. The Calabar port was envisioned as the maritime gateway to Nigeria's southeast, a strategic outlet for agricultural and regional trade. Geographically, it should have been transformative. Economically, it should have been catalytic. Unfortunately, structurally, it is trapped. The physical reality, a channel that will not hold. Calabar's greatest challenge is not on land, it is in the water. The port is accessed through the 800 plus kilometer channel, long, narrow, and highly susceptible to severe and reoccurring siltation. This gives a brutal economic equation. Without dredging, the port is inaccessible to commercial vessels. With dredging, the cost of maintenance becomes extraordinarily high. And even after dredging, the channel quickly begins to degrade again. In simple terms, in very simple terms, Calabar is a port that must be consistent or constantly engineered into existence. The legal and institutional trap. Dredging as a contractual failure. Again, I'm repeating this again, under the NPA Act, it is the responsibility of maintaining navigable access. It is the duty of the NPA to maintain navigable access to all designated ports. For Calabar, this responsibility translated into one central activity, dredging. Over the past 2 decades, multiple multi-billion naira dredging contracts have been awarded with a clear objective: to achieve and maintain and advertise channel depth of approximately 9 meters, but here is where the system breaks down. Instead of delivering navigability, these contracts have produced a cycle of partial execution, disputed performance benchmark, commercial disagreements over scope and payment, and ultimately litigation, arbitration, or outright abandonment. In many cases, contractors claimed completion, regulators disputed actual targets met, achieved depths, payments became contested, and projects Stalled in legal disputes, the result, the channel, has rarely, if ever, consistently met its operational debt target. Core failure, enforcement, not just execution. Calabar's problem is not simply that dredging is difficult, it is that contracts have not been effectively enforced. This raises critical legal concerns where performance benchmarks clearly defined and independently verifiable, where payment structures tied to immeasurable outcomes or to project milestones, did oversight mechanisms detect underperformance early enough, and most importantly, were defaulting contractors ever meaningfully sanctioned? Where answers to these questions are weak, contractors become financial obligations without performance guarantees. From infrastructure failure to governance failure, Calabar is not just a failing port. It is a case study in institutional breakdown, because what we see is a reoccurring pattern. Contracts are awarded at significant public cost, executions fall short of technical requirements, disputes arise over compliance, and payments, projects either prolonged legal battle, projects enter prolonged legal battles, the physical problem, the channel remains unresolved. In this circle, law does not correct failure, it prolongs it. The economic consequence. The implications are severe. Shipping lines avoid Calabar due to draft uncertainty. Cargo is diverted to ports in Lagos or even neighboring countries. The Southeast loses a critical export gateway, and public funds are repeatedly sunk into projects that do not yield sustainable results. Over time, the port transitions from an asset to a liability. Unfortunately, that's the story of the Calabar port. The bigger legal question now that we will answer is, at what point does repeated contractual failure amount to negligence in procurement, weakness in regulatory oversight, or systemic institutional corruption? Because when billions are spent without durable outcomes, the issue is no longer technical, it is a structural and legal one. What lessons have we learned from the Calabar Seaport? Calabar demonstrates a harsh truth. A port cannot survive on intermittent compliance. Dredging, in this context, is not a one-time project. It is a continuous legal and operational obligation that must be properly contracted, rigorously monitored, and strictly enforced. Without that, every contract becomes a temporary fix for a permanent problem. Let us give you our insight on this. If worry reflects a failure to execute statutory duty, then Calabar reflects something deeper, a failure to enforce accountability within the legal system itself, because in the end, a port does not fail simply because nature is difficult. It fails when the law cannot compel performance against that difficulty. Let us look at the future deep ports and cross-cutting challenges. The proposed deep port. Deep ports, the new scramble for deep ports, leveraging on the success of Lekki and acknowledging the limitations of legacy ports. A new scramble for deep sea ports is underway, all competing within the ICRC PPP framework. Bonny, we're going to do a special video on Bonny. AruguInsights would prevail on the River State government to do something about the deep sea port in Bonny. If we wait alone for the federal government, River State will continue to lag behind in the scheme of things. It is a disgrace that a state like River State has no functional seaport. And so, apart from the specialized Onne port that is to service the oil, sector-specific Onne port that is meant to service the oil and gas sector in Nigeria. The Bonny Deep Sea Port project is the federal government flagship project for the East. What is the legal structure? It is projected, design, build, finance, operate, and transfer DBFOT model championed by the Federal Ministry of Marine and Blue Economy. Institutional drivers. The strategic objective is to create a deep draft alternative to Lagos in the heart of the Niger Delta, leveraging Bonny existing status as a global energy hub. If this project clears the complex regulatory hurdles of the ICRC, it could balance Nigeria's maritime trade landscape. Now, that's one. Let us look at the next one. The Ibom Deep Sea Port, Akwa Ibom. The Ibom Deep Sea Port is perhaps the most advanced of the state-led proposals. What's the constitutional navigation? As discussed earlier on, Akwa Ibom cannot build this port alone. The project exists only because a dedicated effort by the Akwa Ibom state government to work within the federal framework. That's what I want River State government to do with the Bonny Seaport. They established a joint implementation committee with the NPA and secured ICRC approval for the PPP procurement process. What is the strategic objective? The Ibom project is legally and conceptually tied to the Ibom Industrial City, a free trade zone designed to process agricultural and natural resources for export. The success of Ibom depends on the legal enforcement of these free zones initiative. And then the Agay Deep Sea Port in Bayelsa. The Agay Deep Sea Port in Bayelsa is a visionary but legally challenging project. It proposes a massive industrial port hub in a remote location. That's a difficult one. The development challenge, the primary institutional barrier is not the maritime law, but the infrastructure connectivity gap. Legally, building the port is one thing. Building the required statutory rail and road corridors through the difficult terrain of the Niger Delta to connect the port to the national market is a separate, massive legislative and funding challenge that currently lacks concrete commitment from the Federal Ministry of Transportation. Let us look at, having considered Ibom, Bonny, and Agay, let us look at the cross-port legal challenges. These are systemic issues. The port-by-port audit reveals specific issues, but several profound legal challenges that affect the entire Nigerian maritime ecosystem. Regulatory overlap, the agency fatigue. Nigeria suffers from a classic case of institutional redundancy. On average, 7 to 10 federal agencies demand distinct inspections, clearances, and payments for a single cargo container. That's not sustainable. The Nigerian Shippers Council, in its role as the port economic regulator, has tried to mandate a standard operating procedure, SOP, to streamline these, but they lack the strong statutory teeth to penalize either federal agencies like the Customs or NAFDAC for non-compliance until a single comprehensive Maritime Omnibus Act creates a unified clearance window. This statutory overlap will continue to choke efficiency. Environmental litigation and community rights. That's another problem that is holding our ports to ransom. The Environmental Impact Assessment Act requires every new port project to conduct a detailed study. However, in the Niger Delta, environmental law intersects with the sensitive issue of host community rights. Under the Petroleum Industry Act 2001, the PIA, host communities must benefit directly from energy projects. While not oil products, eastern ports often service the energy sector. There is an increasing legal precedent for host communities to litigate against port operators and the NPA for environmental degradation, land acquisition without fair compensation, and exclusion from employment, creating a volatile operational environment. Digital transformation and cyber law. The next generation of ports are smart ports relying on ICT, blockchain for bills of lading and automated systems. Nigeria's current Port Act, some written in the 1950s, are woefully deficient and unprepared for this. We urgently need new legislative frameworks governing digital customs procedure, data privacy in the logistic chain, and the crucial legal definitions for liability in autonomous shipping and automated terminal operations. By way of concluding, we would want to state that a comprehensive audit is complete. We have seen that from the Gridlock of Apapa to the deep waters of Lekki, and from the specialized terminals of Onne to the stalled ambitions of Calabar, Nigerian seaports are living organisms shaped by the law. The core conclusion is undeniable. Nigeria's maritime challenge is not a challenge of engineering, It is a challenge of governance. Building Lekki Deep Seaport was the first step. The next and far more difficult step is integrating that new standard across the entire institutional landscape. It requires legislative reform, moving behind the 1954 NPA framework to a modern, digitally native Maritime Act, and then institutional synergy, forcing the federal agencies to cooperate through legally mandated electronic window. And then the third one is strict contract enforcement, ensuring that the NPA executes her statutory dredging duties and private concessionaires meet their KPIs, key performance indexes. Hey, Nigeria has the institutional authority, the natural harbors, and the human capital to be the maritime hub of Africa, but the destiny will only be realized when we strengthen the foundation that supports every crane, every channel, and every cargo. Because ultimately, on the global stage, strong ports require strong laws. As of 2026, Nigeria's Apapa and Tinkan ports are undergoing a comprehensive overhaul funded by a 746 million UK-backed export credit loan structured through the UK Export Finance and tied to use of British goods and services. The project entails a full modernization of port infrastructure, including berths, terminals, and equipment that are aimed at improving efficiency in facilities that handle the bulk of the nation's maritime trade, while simultaneously reinforcing concession-based landlord port model and introducing international standards. All of this, no matter how much we spend, no matter how much loans we take, if the channels are not well dredged, if the roads that lead to the channels are not kept in a good state, all of this investment will be a waste. Buy all the modern cranes in the world and put them in our ports. If access to our ports is fraught with gridlocks, that's a big problem. I want to thank everyone for listening, for joining us on this flagship edition of AruguInsights. Make sure you subscribe for more in-depth policy analysis from all of us here in AruguInsights. I am your anchor and host, Arugu Speaks.
AruguInsights, the show that shines the light. Arugu